The bunker exploded from within, not from our charges, but from theirs, burying their wounded along with their weapons, rather than let us take it intact. Through the smoke, children emerged clutching guns and makeshift spears, singing as they charged towards certain death. Behind me, the temperature plummeted as our shadow flowed across the battlefield like liquid night, turning their songs into screams, then silence. I watched a defender empty his weapon into the darkness, each shot finding nothing, until the shadow touched his forehead and turned him against his own squad with mechanical precision. This was week 8 of their hopeless resistance, 56 days of a futile resistance, of messages written in blood, of a species that never stopped believing they could win even as we erased them from existence. Mission log, day 1. The visor displays readouts with each breath. Atmospheric composition, threat assessment, tactical overlays. Beyond the reinforced glass, this planet is blazing with beauty, as if light here is thicker than at home. I'd only seen pictures in old history books, forests like veins, oceans shimmering silver blue, mountains shouldering the sky. That was our world thousands of years ago, before it rotted. Now it's theirs, and soon it will be ours. We came with enough firepower to crack a moon, expecting orbital defenses, interceptor swarms, the usual symphony of civilized warfare. Instead, we found hollow metal shells, broadcasting music and mathematics to the void. They built monuments to curiosity instead of fortresses. They reached for stars instead of building walls. It almost made me sad. Mission log, day 2. The order came before dawn. Eliminate their eyes in the dark, then cut the throat clean. Our platform drifted from shadow and methodically neutralized their satellites. No return fire, no coordinated response. For 67 seconds, our communications were silent except for status confirmations. The drop was textbook perfect. The ramp opened to reveal air so pure it made my filters work overtime just processing it. Rich, wet atmosphere that clung to everything. Through my seal suit, I could still taste something like hope, like a world that had never learned to be afraid. The locals were waiting below the ridgeline, bipedal, pale-skinned, clutching projectile weapons with shaking hands. Some stared like they wanted to communicate. Others aimed like they wanted to die with dignity. Then our partners crossed the field, and dignity became irrelevant. We called them partners because our military psychologists determined that allies implies an emotional bond that could compromise operational effectiveness. We call them partners because masters would be bad for morale. The truth is simpler and worse. We are the hands, and they are the hunger. You feel a shadow approaching long before visual contact. The air grows thin at the edges of perception. Heat drains from your extremities. The sealed helmet keeps their whispers from penetrating too deeply, but complete protection is impossible. I've read the classified reports from their first deployment. Entire battalions turning their weapons on each other because the inside of their heads suddenly became louder than reality. Our generation has better seals, better psychological conditioning. A shadow flowed across our front line like liquid night. From one angle, transparent as glass. From another, darker than space between stars. Its outline refused to hold steady, as if existence itself couldn't decide what shape nightmares should wear. The locals broke, not when we raised our weapons, but when that absolute cold touched their minds. Half fled, half stood paralyzed. None escaped what can exist everywhere at once. We advanced through what remained. Mission log, week 3, Consolidated Report. 3 weeks teaches you a continent's temperament, long enough to understand that the locals possess a resilience that borders on the supernatural. They fight like each battle might retroactively save everyone they've already lost. We burned through valleys and found ourselves buried in them. We took hills at dawn and lost them by noon when they collapsed their own dams, choosing to drown their homeland rather than surrender it intact. When we fortified positions, they tunneled beneath us with primitive tools and came up through our floors like deadly flowers. They don't beg, they don't negotiate. They make every inch cost more than it's worth. Our casualty reports climbed from acceptable to concerning to classified pending review. When shadows hunt alongside you, you stop measuring progress in territory and start measuring it in silences. I watch one compress itself to the thickness of a blade edge and slip beneath a door that never opened. Voices rose behind the steel barrier, cries, then screams, then sounds that weren't quite screaming and weren't quite laughter. Then, nothing. I observed another stand in full daylight like heat distortion, and 2 defenders dropped their weapons just to claw at their own skulls. I witnessed smoke flow into a ventilation system and emerge as something red and screaming. Projectile weapons found no purchase. Fire gave them temporary form before they absorbed it and became brighter, hungrier versions of themselves. The locals learned to ignite entire city blocks when they detected shadow presence. It slowed them. It never stopped them. But something else happened in those fires. Something the briefings never mentioned. Mission log, Week 5, Consolidated Report. Urban warfare is a different mathematics entirely. The locals retreated into their glass forests, towers that scraped clouds, and then lay broken across avenues wide enough to land shuttles. They fought from basements and tunnels, from caves carved from their own infrastructure, and marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They weaponized everything. Street signs became spears. Kitchen implements became surgical instruments of war. Their primitive projectile weapons rattled when they fired, sounding almost apologetic for the damage they inflicted. I learned to read their barricades like text. A desk meant panic. A vehicle frame meant planning time. Steel cables meant someone who understood warfare was waiting to teach us respect through superior positioning. The shadows grew more active as our timeline compressed. They crave this work. When they pass too close, your vertebrae remember cold from before you were born. I keep my visor sealed. I don't want to know what my eyes might do without the protective barrier between us and them. But in the quiet moments between engagements, I found myself wondering if they were watching all of us, what were they seeing? And why did that thought make my SEALs feel suddenly inadequate? Mission log, Week 8, Consolidated Report. We lost a forward operations base to a trap that should have been obvious in hindsight. 23 personnel. Gone in the time it took to blink. As I filed the report, I experienced something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Respect, perhaps. The kind reserved for storms that would cheerfully remove the top half of your head if you stopped paying attention. These locals knew their terrain with impossible intimacy. They could construct bridges from rubble faster than we could destroy them. They learned our communication frequencies and fed us disinformation so creative, it was sometimes more accurate than our own intelligence reports. They are the most resilient enemy I have encountered in warfare. This is easy to say when it's your first conquest. It remains true after everything that followed. But resilience is not immunity. Resilience is just a word you carve into a wall while the building burns around you. The shadows found their medical facilities first, not to destroy them, to contaminate them, to turn places of healing into places where hope went to die slowly. They moved through corridors without disturbing the air, opening doors that hadn't been touched, speaking with voices that sounded like childhood memories of safety. They moved faster than thought, pulled oxygen from rooms and breathed it back as something else. Something that made people remember every mistake they'd ever made simultaneously. We followed behind them like water following the edge of a blade. Mission log, Week 10, Consolidated Report. We established processing centers for non-combatants and began cataloging resources that didn't exist in our databases. We assigned names to phenomena that resisted classification. We slept in rotating shifts and dreamed in languages we didn't recognize. We learned the sound of their warning systems and the way it unconsciously accelerated our pulse rates. We learned how their final shots echoed like first shots, full of hope that mathematics had already disproven. We also learned that the shadows prefer resistance to submission. The pact governing our partnership is explicit in its mathematics, but there are margins where the numbers attempt to negotiate. We have regulations and they have appetites. Our SEALs maintain adherence to agreed upon parameters. Mission log, Day 70, pre-action assessment. Final objective, final stronghold, final contract fulfilled. Their cartographic systems label it with symbols my translator cannot pass. Our tactical maps designated Objective 9. It spreads along a river like something that learned to breathe and forgot how to stop. Bridges span water bright enough to require polarized filters. Half those bridges were severed by their own demolition teams. Half we eliminated because we don't object to swimming when circumstances require. We initiated assault from 3 vectors simultaneously. Their defensive positions were more sophisticated than anything we'd encountered. Their final stand units wore colored fabric around their limbs and vocalized harmonically while setting explosive charges. They fought like faith nailed to bone. Then the shadows flowed through the smoke, and faith became irrelevant. We breached the hardened position using magnetic charges and patience. Interior contained, elderly individuals, juveniles, combatants, who had exhausted ammunition but not determination. They vocalized in a language that tasted sharp against my auditory processors. I fired because my function is simple and my outcomes are binary, and I prefer my psychological complications to be manageable. Behind us, ambient temperature dropped 17 degrees in 4 seconds. A shadow uncoiled from a corner that hadn't existed until it required definition. Another stepped from a strip of sunlight, as if photons had suddenly decided to become solid and malevolent. The air grew thin. The world became loud inside my skull for approximately 3 seconds, then subsided. We progressed room by room until no rooms remained unaccounted for. The city didn't fall like timber, it fell like snow, one silence at a time. But in those silences, I heard something new. Children laughing. Impossible, since the juveniles were all accounted for in our casualty reports. The laughter sounded like it was coming from inside my helmet. The SEALs held, barely. Mission log, Day 71. Dawn found us still operational. I climbed the skeletal remains of their tallest structure to assess the operational area. Fires painted the horizon in layers. Orange, where combustible materials continued their chemical arguments. Black, where those arguments had reached resolution. Bridges terminated in mid-air. The river carried light downstream, as if it might transport illumination elsewhere for future use. The shadows drifted through the aftermath. Satiated is inadequate terminology. The pact contains no vocabulary for that concept. They were quieter, which approximates contentment by their standards. They circle the urban corpse like atmospheric disturbances in no hurry to produce precipitation. Near the tower's apex, I discovered text carved into composite material with something that had possessed more urgency than time. The incisions were crude and deep. The grooves were still damp when I examined them. You will never win. But we did, and if our partners hadn't arrived with us, we wouldn't. It was time to clear out the planet and make it ready for the civilians to arrive and build home. I envy them as they get to live on this beautiful planet, and we have to go fight side by side with the partners conquering another planet. My unit won't remain for construction. We'll depart with the fleet and walk under different stars elsewhere. Civilian specialists will arrive with their cities in modular containers, unfolding them over the bones of what we conquered. They'll debate plaza configurations and school orientations and which direction sleeping quarters should face to capture morning illumination. There will be markets where craters currently exist. There will be music in streets that currently know only alarm systems. It is sound mathematics. Division by half, equal distribution. We will never visit the half that belongs to our partners. We are not permitted on their side. I stood in the wind at the tower's summit. The filters hummed, faithful as always. I reached for the seal releases. I unsealed my helmet. The air was damp, metallic, thick with ash and blood. I let it fill me, my tendrils unfurling with satisfaction. Below, the last enemy soldier eyes watched a sky they no longer owned. Our new home was secure. Their sacrifice had been inevitable. They called themselves humans. They called their planet Earth